In the remote mountains of northern Maine, where winter can be a brutal test of survival for both humans and wildlife, Dr. Rebecca Stone thought she had reached the lowest point of her life. At 51 years old, the former emergency room physician had retreated to her late grandmother's isolated cabin 6 months earlier, seeking solitude after a devastating divorce and the painful loss of her medical career. Following a malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed her confidence in her faith in helping others, but on that bitter February morning when the temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, Rebecca would make a discovery that would not only save a life but transform her own in ways she never could have imagined. Routine walk to check her mailbox would lead to an encounter with a dying wild bobcat that would challenge her to rediscover her purpose, rebuild her courage, and ultimately find a new calling that would give her life meaning beyond anything she had experienced as a physician. The freezing animal she found that day would become more than just a patient. It would become the catalyst for the most important transformation of her entire life. The crunch of snow beneath Rebecca Stone's boots was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the Maine wilderness as she made her way down the quarter-mile driveway to her mailbox. At 51, Rebecca had grown accustomed to the isolation that had become her refuge from a world that had stripped away everything she had worked 30 years to build. The malpractice lawsuit that had ended her career as an emergency room physician 6 months earlier had left her not just financially devastated, but emotionally shattered and questioning every decision she had ever made about helping others. The bitter cold stung her face as she trudged through snow that reached nearly to her knees. February in northern Maine was unforgiving, with temperatures that could kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. Rebecca had chosen this harsh environment deliberately, finding comfort in its honesty unlike the legal system that had destroyed her reputation. Winter made no false promises and offered no fake sympathy. As she approached the mailbox, a splash of color against the white landscape caught her attention. At first, Rebecca thought it was just debris blown by the wind, but as she moved closer, her medical training kicked in despite her attempts to suppress those instincts. What she saw lying motionless in the snow beside the road was a young bobcat, its distinctive tawny coat marked with the dark spots that made the species unmistakable. The animal was clearly in critical condition. Its breathing was so shallow it was barely visible, and its body was curled into a tight ball in a desperate attempt to conserve what little body heat remained. Ice crystals had formed on its whiskers and around its eyes, indicating prolonged exposure to the deadly cold. Rebecca's experienced eye immediately recognized the signs of severe hypothermia and dehydration. "Damn it," Rebecca muttered, knowing that her instinct to help was about to override the emotional walls she had built around herself. Despite her determination to avoid any situation that might require her to make life or death decisions, she couldn't walk away from a suffering animal, especially one that was clearly dying from exposure. Rebecca knelt in the snow beside the bobcat, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she assessed the animal's condition with the systematic approach that had made her an exceptional emergency physician. The bobcat was young, probably less than a year old, and showed no obvious injuries beyond the effects of exposure. Its eyes were closed, but when Rebecca gently touched its neck to check for a pulse, she detected the faint but steady heartbeat that indicated life was still fighting to persist. "You're not giving up, are you?" Rebecca said softly, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "Well, I guess that makes two of us." The decision to help came naturally, driven by instincts that 25 years of medical practice had ingrained too deeply to be suppressed by 6 months of self-imposed isolation. Rebecca carefully lifted the bobcat, surprised by how light the young animal felt in her arms. The cat's lack of response to being handled indicated just how close to death it had come. The journey back to the cabin felt endless as Rebecca cradled the dying bobcat against her chest. Little body warmth she could provide while moving as quickly as possible through the deep snow. Her grandmother's old cabin had never been intended as a wildlife rehabilitation center, but Rebecca's medical background had left her better prepared than most to handle this type of emergency. As she reached the cabin's front door, Rebecca realized that for the first time in 6 months, she felt a sense of purpose beyond simply surviving each day. The bobcat's life depended on her ability to apply her medical knowledge in a completely new context. and despite her fear of making another mistake that could cost a life, she knew she had to try. "Okay, little one," Rebecca said as she carried the bobcat inside. "Let's see if we can figure this out together." Rebecca's grandmother's cabin had been built for simple living. Not emergency medical procedures, but desperation and medical training combined to transform the modest space into an improvised wildlife treatment center. As she laid the unconscious bobcat on a thick blanket near the wood stove, Rebecca felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had sustained her through countless emergency room crises, tempered now by the knowledge that she was completely alone, with no backup and no safety net if things went wrong. "Core temperature is critically low," Rebecca said aloud, her voice filling the silence as she fell back into the verbal documentation habits that had guided her through years of medical emergencies. "Patient is unconscious, breathing shallow but regular, pulse weak but detectable." The bobcat showed no response to her touch as she began the warming process. Using techniques adapted from treating human hypothermia victims, Rebecca surrounded the animal with warm blankets and positioned heating pads around its body while being careful not to warm too quickly, which could cause dangerous blood pressure changes. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades making critical decisions under pressure. As the cabin filled with warmth from the wood stove, Rebecca began to see subtle signs of improvement in her unlikely patient. The bobcat's breathing became slightly deeper. Its muscle tension began to relax as the warming process gradually raised its core temperature. But Rebecca knew that hypothermia was only part of the challenge. The young animal was clearly malnourished and dehydrated, conditions that would require careful management to avoid complications. "You're fighting," Rebecca observed as she watched the bobcat's condition stabilize. "That's good. I respect fighters." The medical procedures required for treating a wild bobcat forced Rebecca to improvise with supplies and techniques that challenged her creativity and knowledge. Using a combination of veterinary information she found online and her understanding of mammalian physiology, she developed a treatment plan that addressed the animal's immediate needs, while acknowledging her limitations as someone trained in human rather than animal medicine. As the hours passed, Rebecca found herself talking to the unconscious bobcat, sharing thoughts and observations that she hadn't voiced to another living being in months. The isolation that had seemed protective and necessary suddenly felt like a barrier she was ready to lower, at least for this one vulnerable creature who couldn't judge her past failures or question her competence. "I used to save lives every day," Rebecca admitted as she checked the bobcat's vital signs for the 10th time that afternoon. "I was good at it too, really good. But then I made a mistake and someone died. And suddenly, everyone forgot about all the people I had saved." Over the years, the bobcat's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice, the first voluntary movement Rebecca had observed since finding the animal. The small response filled her with hope and reminded her of the countless times she had seen patients begin to respond when they heard familiar voices during their recovery. By evening, the bobcat was showing clear signs of improvement. Its breathing had normalized, its body temperature had returned to a safe range, and it had begun to show occasional signs of consciousness. Rebecca prepared a makeshift bed beside the wood stove where she could monitor the animal throughout the night, knowing that the next 24 hours would be critical for determining whether her improvised treatment had been successful. "I don't know what I'm doing," Rebecca said as she settled in for a long night of observation. "But I know I couldn't walk away and let you die. Maybe that means something." As she watched the bobcat sleep peacefully for the first time since the rescue, Rebecca realized that for the first time in 6 months, she felt hope instead of despair. Saving this animal's life was becoming more than just a medical challenge. It was becoming a pathway back to the person she used to be. Dawn brought encouraging signs that Rebecca's improvised treatment had been successful. The young bobcat was not only conscious but alert, its amber eyes tracking Rebecca's movements around the cabin with the wary intelligence of a wild predator, who understood that its survival had depended on the kindness of a potential enemy. The transformation from the nearly lifeless creature Rebecca had found in the snow was remarkable. But it also presented new challenges that tested her growing confidence in her ability to help. "Good morning, survivor," Rebecca said softly as She approached with food and water. "See how you're feeling today." The bobcat's response to her presence was a mixture of gratitude and instinctive caution. While the animal clearly recognized Rebecca as the source of its salvation, its wild nature remained intact, creating a delicate balance between trust and wariness that Rebecca found both challenging and rewarding to navigate. Feeding a recovering wild bobcat required research and creativity that pushed Rebecca beyond her medical training into the realm of wildlife biology. Using online resources and calls to wildlife rehabilitation centers, she developed a nutrition plan that would support the animal's recovery while respecting its carnivorous nature and wild dietary needs. "You need protein. Lots of it," Rebecca explained as she prepared the bobcat's first substantial meal since the rescue. "And I need to figure out how to be a wildlife rehabilitator instead of an emergency room doctor." The feeding process became a lesson in patience and observation. That reminded Rebecca of the diagnostic skills that had made her an exceptional physician. She learned to read the bobcat's body language, understanding when it was comfortable enough to eat, when it needed space to process the stress of captivity and human contact. As the bobcat's strength returned, its personality began to emerge. Rebecca discovered that her patient was curious and intelligent, showing interest in the cabin's environment, while maintaining the cautious alertness that had helped it survive in the wild before its near-fatal encounter with the Maine winter. "You're not just surviving," Rebecca observed as she watched the bobcat explore its temporary enclosure. "You're adapting. That's a skill I could learn from." The daily routine of caring for the recovering bobcat created structure and purpose. In Rebecca's life that had been missing since her withdrawal from the world, each feeding, each health check, each small sign of improvement became a victory that reminded her of the satisfaction she had once found in helping others heal. But the most profound change was in Rebecca herself. The isolation that had seemed necessary for protecting her wounded spirit began to feel less like safety and more like imprisonment. Caring for the bobcat required her to engage with the outside world, calling wildlife experts, researching treatment options, and planning for the animal's eventual return to the wild. "I think you're ready for a name," Rebecca said as she watched the bobcat demonstrate its returning strength and agility. "How about Aurora, like the northern lights? Something beautiful that appears when you least expect it and reminds you that there's still magic in the world." Aurora's response was a soft, chittering sound that Rebecca chose to interpret as approval. The name felt right for an animal who had brought light back into Rebecca's darkened world and reminded her that healing was possible, even after the most devastating losses. As Aurora's recovery progressed, Rebecca began to face the reality that their time together was temporary. The bobcat belonged in the wild, not in a cabin with a woman who was still learning to trust herself again. But the bond they had formed during the critical days of Aurora's recovery had awakened something in Rebecca that she thought had been permanently damaged by her professional and personal failures. "You saved my life just as much as I saved yours," Rebecca admitted as she watched Aurora demonstrate the hunting instincts that would be essential for survival in the wild. "Now we both need to figure out what comes next." 3 weeks after the rescue, Aurora had transformed from a dying animal into a magnificent example of wild bobcat vitality. Her recovery so complete that Rebecca knew the time for release back into the wild was approaching rapidly.
Oh.
But the prospect of saying goodbye to the creature who had given her life purpose again filled Rebecca with an anxiety that went beyond simple attachment to a patient she had saved. "You're ready, Rebecca," said as she watched Aurora demonstrate perfect hunting reflexes during a play session with a feather toy. "Your instincts are sharp, your strength is back, and you're starting to pace like you need more space than this cabin can provide." Aurora's increasing restlessness was a clear sign that her wild nature was asserting itself over the temporary comfort of human care. She spent more time looking out the windows toward the forest, her body language expressing a longing for the freedom that was her birthright. Rebecca recognized these signs as indicators of successful rehabilitation, but they also marked the approaching end of the relationship that had become the center of her rebuilt world. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a wildlife veterinarian from the States' rehabilitation program, arrived to assess Aurora's readiness for release. Her evaluation confirmed what Rebecca already knew. The Bobcat was physically and psychologically prepared to return to independent life in the wild. "You've done exceptional work," Dr. Martinez told Rebecca as she completed her examination of Aurora. "This level of rehabilitation success is remarkable, especially considering you have no formal training in wildlife care. Your medical background obviously helped, but there's something more here. This animal trusts you in a way that suggests you provided more than just medical treatment." Rebecca felt a mixture of pride and sadness at the veterinarian's assessment. Aurora's successful recovery validated her ability to make life-saving decisions again, but it also meant that their partnership was ending, just as Rebecca was beginning to understand what it might mean for her future. "What happens to someone like me who discovers they want to do this kind of work?" Rebecca asked Dr. Martinez. "I mean officially, professionally." The question surprised Rebecca even as she asked it. For 6 months, she had been certain that her career helping others was permanently over, that her mistake had disqualified her from ever being trusted with vulnerable lives again. But Aurora's recovery had awakened a sense of calling that felt even stronger than her original motivation to become a physician. Dr. Martinez's response opened possibilities that Rebecca hadn't allowed herself to consider. "Wildlife rehabilitation needs people with medical training," she explained. "There are certification programs, volunteer opportunities, and ultimately career paths for people who have the skills and dedication you've demonstrated. The field is growing, and there's always a need for people who can handle the medical complexity of treating wild animals." That evening, as Rebecca prepared Aurora's enclosure for what would likely be their last night together, she found herself imagining a future that combined her medical expertise with the passion for wildlife care that Aurora had awakened in her. The prospect of starting over at 51 was daunting, but it was also exciting in a way that reminded her of the enthusiasm she had felt as a young medical student. "You've given me more than I gave you," Rebecca said as she watched Aurora settle in for the night. "I saved your life, but you saved mine in a way that matters more. You reminded me that I still have something valuable to offer and that mistakes don't have to define the rest of my story." Aurora's soft, chittering response seemed to acknowledge the depth of their connection and the significance of the transformation they had both undergone. Tomorrow would bring the bittersweet process of release. But tonight, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future and confidence in her ability to build a new life around helping others heal. The morning of Aurora's release dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline winter beauty that made the Maine wilderness feel both welcoming and challenging. Rebecca had chosen a location deep in the forest, far from roads and human habitation, where Aurora would have the best chance of reclaiming her wild life without interference. But as she prepared the transport carrier for what would be their final journey together, Rebecca struggled with emotions that went far beyond the typical sadness of saying goodbye to a recovered patient. "This is what success looks like," Rebecca reminded herself as she secured Aurora's carrier in the back of her truck. "You don't measure success by keeping them dependent on you. You measure it by giving them back their freedom." Aurora seemed to sense the significance of the day. Her behavior in the carrier was different from previous trips to the veterinarian, more alert, more anticipatory, as if she understood that this journey would lead to something fundamentally different from the routine of captive care. The drive to the release site took them deep into old-growth forest where bobcats had roamed for centuries. Before human settlement changed the landscape, Rebecca had spent weeks researching and scouting to find the perfect location and area with abundant prey, clean water sources, and minimal human interference that would give Aurora the best chance of successful reintegration into wildlife. "This is your neighborhood," Rebecca said as she parked the truck at the end of a logging road that hadn't been used in years. "Everything you need to build a good life is here. Just have to remember how to use what you were born knowing." The release process required careful planning to minimize stress for Aurora while ensuring her safety during the transition back to wildlife. Rebecca had designed a soft release protocol that would allow Aurora to leave the carrier voluntarily and explore her new territory at her own pace, without feeling pressured or threatened by human presence. As Rebecca opened the carrier door and stepped back to give Aurora space to emerge, she felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that reminded her of the moment when a patient leaves intensive care to begin independent recovery. The outcome was never guaranteed, but the foundation for success had been carefully established. Emerged from the carrier slowly, every sense alert as she processed the sights, sounds, and scents of the forest that would become her new home. Her body language was confident but cautious, demonstrating the perfect balance between boldness and survival wisdom that would serve her well in the wild. "Take your time," Rebecca said softly, fighting back tears as she watched Aurora take her first steps toward freedom. "There's no rush. This is your place now." For several minutes, Aurora remained near the carrier, using it as a security base while she explored the immediate area. She investigated fallen logs, tested the snow depth, and scanned the forest canopy with the systematic thoroughness of a predator assessing new hunting territory. Then, without warning or ceremony, Aurora made her choice. She looked directly at Rebecca for a long moment in exchange that felt like acknowledgement, gratitude, and farewell all at once, before walking confidently into the forest and disappearing among the trees. Rebecca stood alone in the clearing for nearly an hour after Aurora vanished, processing the complex emotions of loss, pride, and transformation that marked the end of their journey together. The silence felt different, now not empty, but full, of possibilities and new beginnings. "Thank you," Rebecca said to the forest where Aurora had begun her new life, "for everything." As she drove home, Rebecca's mind was already focused on the future she was about to build. Dr. Martinez had provided contact information for wildlife rehabilitation programs, certification courses, and volunteer opportunities that would allow Rebecca to transform her experience with Aurora into a new career dedicated to helping wild animals survive and thrive. The woman who returned to the cabin that day was fundamentally different from the one who had found a dying bobcat in the snow 5 weeks earlier, stronger, more hopeful, and ready to begin again. What began as a chance encounter with a dying bobcat in the Maine wilderness became the catalyst for the most profound transformation of Rebecca Stone's life. Aurora's rescue didn't just save the life of one wild animal, it rescued a woman who had lost faith in her ability to heal and help others, proving that sometimes the most important patients are the ones who teach us how to save ourselves. Today, Rebecca works as a certified wildlife rehabilitator, operating a facility that has saved hundreds of animals while providing her with a sense of purpose that surpasses even her former career as a physician. Aurora's influence extends far beyond her own rescue, inspiring a new approach to wildlife care that combines medical expertise with deep respect for the wild nature of the animals being helped. The freezing bobcat that Rebecca found that bitter February morning taught her that healing is a reciprocal process, that in saving others, we often discover how to save ourselves. Aurora's trust in a stranger who chose to help rather than walk away demonstrated the transformative power of compassion and the unexpected ways that lives can intersect to create profound change. Rebecca's journey from despair to purpose proves that it's never too late to begin again, that past failures don't have to define future possibilities, and that sometimes the most important calling in life comes from the most unexpected sources. Her willingness to risk her emotional safety to help a dying animal opened pathways to healing that no amount of self-protection could have provided. Aurora's successful return to the wild represents more than just good rehabilitation practice. It symbolizes the possibility of reclaiming authentic life after devastating loss. Both the woman and the bobcat learned that survival isn't just about staying alive, but about rediscovering the courage to engage fully with life again. The bond formed between human and wild animal during those critical weeks of recovery continues to influence Rebecca's work in philosophy, reminding her daily that the most meaningful connections often form when we choose compassion over caution and action over apathy. If this incredible story of mutual rescue and life transformation moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories of healing and hope. Like this video and share it with anyone who believes in the power of second chances and the courage to begin again. Comment below and tell us about a time when helping someone or something else helped you discover your own strength and purpose. Your story might inspire our next heartwarming video. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, and remember, sometimes the life you save might just be your own.